As they're making their way back, you've had it read to you, you've had it as part of your communion meditation. But I'd like for you to get your Bible, whether it's on your phone or your tablet or in the pew in front of you, open it up to Philippians, the 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 11. I'm not going to read it again, but we are going to be talking about it together. And as you're getting there, I was once told when I was learning to be a preacher, I was taking a preaching class, and I was told there was one phrase that you can use, and it will get everyone's attention. It doesn't matter if they had a long day. It doesn't matter if they're starting to slump in the pew and go to sleep. It doesn't matter if they've been distracted. It doesn't matter if they don't want to be here and they're thinking about what's going to come next. If you use this one magic phrase, they will automatically clue in. And so we were all going like, what's that phrase? What's that phrase? We want to know what that is. He says, all you have to do is say, in conclusion. However, you can only use it once during the sermon. Because if you kept saying in conclusion, you get their attention, but if you kept saying that in conclusion and in conclusion and in conclusion, pretty soon they're not going to believe you anymore. And so they're just going to go back to wherever their mind was to start with, and you're going to lose them all over again. It's kind of like the little boy who cried wolf. You just can't use that magic phrase that way. You've probably noticed, if you've studied this passage before, that most modern English translations have Paul beginning this 3rd chapter with the phrase, finally, brethren. The NIV that we used earlier used the word moreover, which is probably better because, Paul wasn't bringing his letter to an end at the beginning of the 3rd chapter. There's two more chapters to go. And the same Greek word that gets translated in almost all the other English translations as finally can also be translated furthermore. And in this situation, that's more appropriate. After all, Paul did have something he wanted to add to his declaration that he was going to be sending help to Philippi and the believers there with the problems that they were facing that was threatening their unity. He wanted them to recognize what he wanted them to do. Furthermore, brethren, I want you to rejoice in the Lord. Now, you may not realize this, but the phrase he uses was a particular phrase that only shows up in 4 other places in the whole Bible. And whenever he said, I want you to rejoice in the Lord, you might be thinking, would these believers in ancient Philippi really have anything to rejoice about if the unity of their church was in such attack and they were having so many problems that they needed Paul to actually send Timothy and Epaphroditus to show up and to help them make it through? And the answer is yes, they had a lot to rejoice over. This phrase, as I said earlier, rejoice in the Lord, is only used whenever God's people are said to be facing an impossible situation. They're looking at the circumstances around themselves and they see the enemies who are attacking them and they think that the odds are so overwhelming that there's no way they're going to be victorious. And they give up any hope of being able to defend themselves and they cry out for God to come and deliver them, to save them from their enemies. One of the places where that phrase, rejoice in the Lord, shows up is in Psalm 35, where David, you remember David, the little boy who showed up all of Israel because Goliath was up there and nobody wanted to challenge him, and little David says, you just got to have trust in the Lord. And he goes out and he defeats Goliath. We know that story, right? It's this David who's now a little bit older. This David who's now king. This David who's now done some things in his life which were not so faithful. And he's facing a situation in his life and he's wondering. He's wondering, am I going to make it? He's not real sure if he's going to make it. He's looking at the enemies around him, and David's thinking, I'm in trouble here. There's no way that I can do this on my own. I'm going to need God. The only way I'm going to make it, I'm going to need God to fight for me. And so in Psalm 35, he actually asked God, and this is sort of an interesting prayer. King David says, God, I want you to draw your buckler. Now, granted, that's an English one. You know, we think of the pirates, and they got this big sword. He goes, I want you to draw your sword. I want you to pull up your shield. I want you to pick up your spear. I want you to grab hold of your battle axe, whatever that means for God. And I want you to come and fight my battle. He actually says, God, what I really want to hear is I want to hear your voice saying, I am your salvation. Lord, I want you to turn the tide of my situation so that when I look at my enemies, they're not the people who are bearing down on me, but they look like chaff that's being blown before the wind and you're just being carried off. Lord, I want to see them like dust that gets stirred up and gets carried away by the wind. It was a similar kind of prayer that Isaiah would offer, and a similar kind of prayer that Zechariah would offer. And now it's the same prayer that Paul is making. Whenever this church looked at the problems that they faced, the enemies were threatening the unity of the church, and they looked like they had the upper hand. But Paul wanted these faithful believers to understand that just like the ones who had gone before them and found themselves in an impossible situation, that even this battle in their church belonged to the Lord. As Paul wrote this letter, he envisioned the help that he was sending to them. He envisioned it as help that was on the way, and you'll read this earlier in chapter 2. But by the time the believers in Philippi actually read this letter, that help had already showed up. They'd already delivered the letter. They were reading it, and they were hearing for themselves what Paul's instructions were to them. The help had arrived. And like King David and Isaiah and Zechariah, Paul wanted them to rejoice in God's victory before it ever happened. Think about that. When do we usually rejoice? We usually rejoice after the fact, right? After the victory has already been won, after we've seen our enemies overcome. And here is Paul saying, I want you guys, your part in this is let the Lord and have trust in him. He's going to be victorious, and I want you to rejoice in the Lord. This is really not your battle, and God is going to see it through. And then Paul says, I don't mind repeating myself to you guys. I mean, I've told you. In fact, what we're going to talk about today is something that we've heard on and off through this entire series that we've studied through the book of Philippians. And it's going to say, like, well, didn't you just preach this last week, or maybe the week before, or maybe the week before? And the answer is yes, because Paul is repeating himself. And he doesn't mind repeating himself when it comes to the truth, whenever we encounter someone who is upsetting a congregation because they're basically telling those people your salvation is in question. I know that you think that you're in a right relationship with God, but we're here to let you know that that's really not true. It was a great illustration in the children's message. It was good in our communion message, that there are some people who disturb believers by saying, I know that you think you're in a right relationship with God, but let me tell you, you're really not. I know that you put your trust in him and you have faith in him and you think you're in there, but really, you're not. What you need to do is become like me. And back then, by becoming like me, they meant you need to become Jewish first. You see, Jesus was the Messiah of the Jewish people, and there were some believers who said, yeah, he really is the Messiah, but in order to accept this new covenant that God is making with us based on faith, you have to enter into the old covenant first. And so while you think you are, you're really not. You've got to have this first covenant in advance. And so you need to start keeping the law of Moses just like we keep it. Paul reminded them again of what he was telling to them by using an imperative. An imperative is just command language. He uses a command language 3 different times. He goes, this is what I want you guys to do in regard to these people who are saying that your salvation isn't really working for you. I want you to keep your eye on them. He says, keep your eye on them. Keep your eye on them. Keep your eye on him. He says it 3 times. Usually when we say things 3 times, it's important. And each time he said it, he described these people who were questioning their salvation. He calls them dogs, he calls them evildoers, and he calls them mutilators of the flesh. Those are pretty strong words. If you were to call someone those kinds of words today, you might offend them. Just guessing, you might. Paul was offending them. He was doing it on purpose. He was saying, hey guys, you need to watch these guys who are dogs. These enemies, they're really, you got to keep your eye on them. Why do you have to keep your eye on someone like that? Because they're going to continue in this lie that you need to enter into the old covenant before you can accept the new covenant. And you need to watch them carefully so that you don't get pulled into the lie that they're spreading. They, Paul said, were not to trust them in regard to the gospel. The good news was that they were already in a covenant relationship with God. They had accepted Christ. They were in a good standing with God. They had a relationship with him, just like the little gift that was being offered to Freya. They had already received the gift of salvation, and now there was someone came in and going like, well, yeah, I know the gift is good, but you need to earn that gift. And here are all the ways that you can earn it. You can start doing the things that Moses is. And by you guys out there who are not circumcised, one of the things that you need to do is that you need to get circumcised in order to accept the salvation that God has already given you. As I said last week, and as Paul is repeating himself in these words, there's not a lot of guys who are real excited about that. We want to hear that there's nothing we have to do. It has already been done for us. And Paul repeats himself again. He says, we are. This inclusive we. We are. Not just including himself and not just including the believers in Philippi, but including everyone who has already responded to the gospel by faith. It says we are in a covenant relationship by God. He doesn't use those exact words, but that's what he's talking about. They didn't need to do anything more to establish a relationship with God. The we, Paul clarified, were those who serve in the Spirit of God and the glory in Christ Jesus, who put no confidence in the flesh. That is, follow all those rules. That's not how we have a relationship with God. That might not be how you would describe yourself. If someone were to come to you and say, hey, tell me about your relationship with God, you would probably not say, well, I'm someone who serves in the Spirit of God, and I glory in Christ, and I put no confidence in the flesh. I've never heard anyone say that when I've asked them what their relationship with God is. It usually says, like, well, I'm a believer. We can try to kind of narrow it down. But even though this might not be how you would describe yourself, it does describe you. I used the word serve, and in your translation, it might use the word worship. Most English Bibles at this point use the word worship instead of serve. It's the Greek term latru. It is the word that we get liturgy from. If you ever went to a church that has a liturgy, that's a word for service that they describe the acts of worship with. It's a word for serving. It's not the most common word for worship. In fact, the most common word for worship that shows up everywhere else in scriptures that always talks about worship is a word, a compound word that's proskuneo. Pros toward, kuneo to, it actually means to lick. It usually gets softened to kiss toward, because that sounds a whole lot better than to lick toward, right? But this word that gets translated lick was also their word for dog. Why would you ever use a word that means lick for a dog? I don't know, have you ever owned a dog? They lick everything, right? And they don't always lick good things, they just lick everything. That's how they experience the world around them. They lick stuff. And so that was their term for dog. And so it's sort of interesting that the word for worship was their word for dog, and we're supposed to dog toward. That's the most common word for worship. Now, what they were thinking about is how a dog comes to its master. You know how dogs come to their master. They come and they recognize the master and they go into submission. They just go down. I mean, it's natural to them. They just sort of drop on the ground and they'll sort of lick toward the master. Sometimes the master will put the hand down so they can lick the hand or something like that. And that's the word for worship. That's the common word for worship. The word for laturo, to serve, is what the dog did before he comes back to worship. He has gone and done whatever the master is wanting him to do, and he's coming back excited that he's pleased the master, and then he begins to submit himself. I don't know about you, but there are some people who submit themselves to all kinds of stuff. We used to have a dog that was very submissive. I mean, he was a big dog. I loved this dog, but he was like the super submissive dog. He was not dominant over anyone ever. In fact, I once, just teasing my dog, I got a balloon. It was sort of, bouncing down. It had air into it. And I was sort of like, oh, nice little balloon. And we had a watermelon, same thing. Oh, nice little watermelon. And my dog went submissive to it. It's just like, you are such a submissive dog. But Paul is saying there's only one person we're supposed to be submissive to, and that is Christ, because we've got a relationship with him. We have a relationship with God in which he is our master, in which we are serving him, in which Christ is getting the glory from. That's why this term for worship, if you read just a common dictionary, it will say the word to prostrate, to lay down before. It won't give you the word picture behind it. It won't give you the breakdown of the literal word. It'll just say, oh, it just means to bow before. But there's so much more in this word of worshiping. These two words, to serve, which is our text, and to worship, both appear in the same phrase that Jesus used once. You remember that time whenever Jesus was, he was out in the wilderness. He'd just been baptized, the Spirit had led him out in the wilderness, and Satan was tempting him. After all the temptations, Satan's final opportunity, his final attack, his final way of trying to get Jesus to crack was to say, all these things I'll give to you if you just proskuneo me. He wanted Jesus to act like a dog and go submissive and lick toward him. And Jesus responded by saying, Satan, it's time for you to go. Because it's written, you shall proskuneo the Lord your God alone. And you will latruo, you will serve him only. Latruo was the doing, the serving. Paul wanted these believers in ancient Philippi by the Spirit of God because they had a relationship with him. And so they were in this new covenant and they had God's Spirit in their lives. And he said, by God's Spirit, I want you to serve God by doing whatever it is that he directs you to. And when you return, to worship him by giving Christ the glory. He did not want them to trust in themselves, to trust their flesh, to trust their own ability to please God without a relationship with God. Anyone can trust themselves, but it doesn't help your relationship with God. And so that's why Paul goes into this example of saying, hey, if you want to look at yourself and you want to put stock in yourself and you want to sort of trust your own ability, you know what? Of all these people who are coming to you and saying, you need to do those things, I've already been there. I've already been one of those old covenant people. And so he does set forth his own example of being an old covenant person who has gone into a new covenant with God. Paul said all those things that those believers are telling you that you now need in order to be saved. Circumcision, that acknowledgement and relationship with God, your right ancestry, your obedience to that law, and even your opposition to the church in its new covenant message. And he gives that impressive resume that we heard earlier. I'm just going to read what Paul said. I was circumcised on the 8th day. You see, you're not just supposed to be circumcised, which is a mark that you're in a relationship with God, but you need to do it on the 8th day. And if you're really going to do it right, it's going to be the 8th day with the priest at the temple. And Paul kind of indicates that that's what happened. I'm from the nation of Israel. My blood runs in God's family. I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. That was one of those faithful tribes, not one of those that ended up in the north. As to zeal, as to the law, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. I'm a Pharisee. Now, we often give the Pharisees a hard time, but the word Pharisee means pure. They actually believe that in order for the Christ to come, we just need to get the nation to start living right. And if we can get them to be pure, then the Messiah will show up. Of course, they had it all wrong, but that's what the Pharisees were doing. That's why they wanted everyone to live according to the law and get it right. They really believed that if everyone started living right, the Messiah would show up. Rather than realizing that it's because everyone is living wrong that the Messiah is showing up to deliver us. But he said, I was one of those guys. And I was faultless. How many of you can say that about your obedience to God's way of living? Most of us say, now let me tell you about all the times I screwed up and why I need salvation so much. Paul did not have a I was so bad story. He didn't have a I was rebellious, or I got drunk all the time, or I was involved in sex, or whatever your bad story might be. His story was, I was raised in God's family, and I was always obedient. But he understood that his obedience wasn't enough. You know, there are people who think that they're good enough. There are people who think that they haven't ever done anything wrong. Paul was one of those people who could have said that kind of thing. But he understood the truth. As to the law, he was blameless. And he considered all of those things that these people were telling them they needed to do in order to affirm Christ's real love and forgiveness in their lives. He goes, all these supposed benefits, it's rubbish. I don't know about you, but I like benefits. Do you like benefits? I think most people, we're honest, we like benefits. We like having extra good things in our lives. We like being rewarded. We like having those kinds of things happen to us. However, most of us are not real excited about garbage. You know, I've never seen, we've never had, and I'm glad, thank you elders, we've never had a year in which they've sort of gone through the evaluation and they've come to Steve and I and said, you know what, you guys have done so well that we're going to give you the entire dumpster at the back of the church. It's awesome. We're just going to give that to you because we're so excited for you. They haven't done that. Not once have I ever heard anyone who's getting ready to go camping say, hey, honey, I've got everything to go. I only have one more thing. I'm going to get the garbage and bring it in. We're going to need that when we get there. I can't wait to go, and we've got a lot of smelly stuff in here. It's going to be great. No, we like the benefits. But when it comes to garbage, man, we want to get rid of it. Part of the problem is that these guys didn't know the difference between the two. They didn't realize that the old covenant was really like garbage for them. So I want you to understand that this was not a matter of one man's trash is another man's treasure. The works of the flesh is trash for everyone. It's rubbish when it comes to our relationship with God. We need the good benefits that can only come when we trust Christ to keep his promises. And that's all that we need. Jesus spoke of the motivations that sweep people away whenever they recognize that there's something great. He spoke about a man who had been searching for a treasure, and in particular, he was searching for a pearl of great price. He was looking for a jewel, so to speak. And he searched and he searched, and he finally found it. And when he found it, he went back and he sold everything he had. He got rid of everything in his life so that he could finally afford this great pearl. It was Jesus' way of saying, there are some people who are looking for the new covenant. There are some people who are looking for what I'm offering. And whenever they find it, they're willing to look at all the things they once valued in their life and realize it's nothing compared to this great pearl of the gospel. He said there was this other guy who was a farmer. He wasn't searching for a great prize. He was just sort of plowing along in his field. It wasn't even his field. He was sort of a tenant farmer. And so he was just plowing around in this field that he was working, trying to make a living, just going about daily life. And he runs into something with his plow, and he realizes there's a hidden treasure here. Nobody knows about this. I don't know if anybody's ever heard about this. There's this treasure. And he goes and he sells all the stuff that's of value in his life, and he buys the field so he can have the treasure. There are some people who aren't looking for Jesus. They aren't looking for the good news. But they stumble on it, and when they see it, they recognize its worth. And then they look about all the things in their life that they had once valued, and they said, there's no comparison there. I'm going to get rid of all of it so I can have this treasure. That's how Jesus said that we're supposed to value what he has done for us on the cross. Now, Paul said that doesn't mean because I put my trust in Christ to forgive me that I'm just going to stop doing good things. He spent his whole life being blameless. He said, I'm going to still keep living a blameless life, but I'm not going to do it because it's somehow establishing or maintaining my relationship with God. I'm not going to do it because it's something that's required. It's going to flow because I have a relationship with God. I'm going to do the right things because I'm now set free to do them, to live the way God would want me to. I'm going to be able to serve him. And I'm going to be able to come back, and I'm going to be so excited. I'm going to go submissive, and I'm going to give Christ the glory in it. It says it's not about me. It's not my righteousness. In fact, I didn't even deserve what Christ considers right. It's through his sacrifice that's been bestowed on me. It's undeserved. What do you do with one of those dogs that comes back and they didn't do what you wanted them to do? You ever had that experience? I come home sometimes and my little dog, and I can tell, I don't know what he's done wrong, but he's sort of cowering on the chair. And so I know he's done something that he thinks isn't right. Sometimes it's pretty obvious. And other times I'm going around like, man, I don't see anything. You've been a good dog. But he's going like, no. I wanted to be all excited about you, and I wanted to be able to kiss towards you, and I wanted to go submissive, all that kind of stuff. But I know I've done something wrong, and I can't. And he's going like, no. You might not deserve it, but you know what? I still love you. You're still my dog. You know, I'm going to take care of it. You can still worship me. I love you. We're going to take care of this. I don't know if all dogs go to heaven, but those of us who learn to submit to Christ do. Paul said, I've come to know Christ. This term for knowing that's used there is a term for having an experience that you learn from. It's the word gnosko. Not the kind of the knowledge that comes from seeing, not the kind of knowledge that comes from reading, but the kind of knowledge that comes from Actually, have you done it? And he uses that phrase, and some of our English translations says for him, I want to know Christ, like it's something in the future. But it's actually the aorist tense, which is sort of a past tense, which means I have known Christ. Or I am in the process of continuing to know Christ. How did he know Christ? Well, the rest of that phrase tells us how he experienced Christ. We know his conversion story on the road to Damascus and his time there. But this is another way he talks about that. He says, I have come to experience Christ through the power of his resurrection. Isn't that how we experience Christ? The power of his resurrection, the power that cancels sin, the power that allows us to be forgiven and drawn into this covenant relationship with God where he becomes our master and we are set free to serve him and worship him. He said, I've experienced the fellowship of his sufferings. It is the word koinonia, the word that we get fellowship from. We usually think of fellowship when we have a meal that we share together. That's fellowshipping, as if it's a social kind of thing. In fact, we've missed that this last year, haven't we? He says, I experienced the fellowship of his sufferings. Paul had been united with Christ in his death. Paul knew what it was like for Christ to suffer, and he had entered into that. He experienced that. He actually uses the phrase, he says, I have even shared the form of his death. Now, Paul was well alive. When did he share the form of his death? Well, as he wrote in the 6th chapter of the letter to the Romans, don't all of you know who you've been baptized into Christ, that you have been united with him in his death so that you could be raised up into his life? Paul had experienced that. And because of those experiences, he says with assurance, he says with confidence, not I will attain, but I am confident of attaining the resurrection of the dead. You remember earlier, chapter 2, he had that whole thing, man, am I going to die or I'm going to live? But for me to live is Christ and die is gain. He wasn't questioning whether that was going to happen or not. He knows because of my experience with Christ, I'm going to have resurrection. I think Paul's point is quite clear. He wanted the Philippian believers to understand that they knew Jesus in the same way and they could have the same assurances because they had that same relationship. And no one could take that relationship away from them because they were stepping in and saying, oh, wait a second, you think you have that gift, but really you got to do all these other things. And Paul was saying, no, keep your eye on those guys. They got it all mixed up. He didn't say run them out of the church. He didn't say get rid of them. So just keep your eye on them. I think Paul's hope was that they too would come to the truth and they would become new covenant people just as Paul himself was. You see, our hope isn't to run anyone off from the gospel. Our hope is to draw them in so that they can receive that free gift that we all enjoy. That we might be a good dog. We're going to have a hymn of invitation. If you are not in a relationship where you feel free to serve and worship God, we invite you to accept the offer that Jesus makes to forgive you and to draw you into a relationship with Christ. And if you are in that relationship,